I always forget, this meeting is being recorded. Welcome to today's news briefing. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services and your moderator. I'm joined by Anthony Advincula, our National Media Director, who's in Atlanta. Today, we focus on redistricting in Alabama, the process by which Alabama legislators come together once a decade to draw new district lines that ensure all communities, especially historically underrepresented groups, get the representation and resources they deserve. I want to express our thanks to Alabama Values, especially Anisha Hardy, and their coalition partners, whom you will hear from today, for helping to organize today's briefing. With the release of 2020 census figures showing dramatic shifts in population, redistricting season is in full swing. Between September 1st and September 15th, Alabama's legislature will hold a series of hearings across the state as it prepares to redraw the political districts to reflect the new census figures. Today's speakers will share with you what grassroots organizations are doing to ensure Alabama's underrepresented populations are heard and that all state legislators draw fair maps that include Alabama's residents. You will hear from 6 speakers, each of whom has between 6 to 8 minutes, far too short a time. We will take questions midway and at the end of their presentations. Please be sure to write your questions in the chat box, and speakers, watch the chat questions, and if there are ones you can answer during the conference, please do. We have prepared a fact sheet which we will send all reporters this afternoon, along with the video of today's conference and an extended who's who with bios for the speakers. It's very important for us that people on this call know who these speakers are and how to reach them, what their contact information is. To our speakers, please speak slowly for our interpreters, who will be interpreting your remarks simultaneously in Spanish, Korean, and Mandarin. Now, let's begin. Our first speaker, Evan Milligan, Executive Director of Alabama Forward and of Alabama's Civic Table. Mr. Milligan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sandy. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. As Sandy said, my name is Evan Milligan. I'm the director of Alabama Forward. We're a membership-based coalition of groups, civic engagement groups based around the state, all working to make sure that Alabama's democratic institutions are as accessible as possible to all who live here. It's exciting to be here today on the heels of the census data, the 2020 census data being released. We learned a lot of interesting things about our state and our communities. We learned that our state has grown in population by 6.3% since 2010. So we're now at a little over 5 million people. Our pace of growth is behind the stronger economic neighbors here in the Deep South, such as Florida and the Carolinas, Tennessee and Georgia, but we're outpacing our neighbors to the west in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. When we look at the source of the population growth here, there are some important things to observe. First, that population growth occurred despite an overall decline in our birth population and rise in our death rates as our elders are beginning to transition in larger numbers. And it declined also despite an outward migration of Alabamians who were born in the state. So at the beginning of the 2010s, we had international migration providing a large bulk of that growth. And then towards the end of the 2010s, particularly last year in 2020, there was a surge in domestic migration with folks either moving back to the state or to the state for the first time. And it's important to think about that growth and to think about where it's taking place. We know that the northern region of the state, particularly anchored by Huntsville, is driving that population growth. And that's also occurring from the Tennessee-Mississippi border onto the Tennessee-Georgia border. There are counties, the fastest growing counties are those that are surrounding Madison County, where Huntsville is based, as well as Baldwin County, capitalizing on those who want to retire near the beach. And then our university towns that are based in Lee and Tuscaloosa County, and then Shelby County, which is a suburb of Birmingham. And also, when we look at the demographics of that population growth, we see something very interesting that we want to think about today. The population of white Alabamians has shrunk in terms of both in terms of total number and also the percentage of the population, from 68.5% of the population to 64.1%, 68.5 in 2010 to 64.1 in 2020. In contrast, our people of color here in the state, communities have been growing. In terms of percentage, Black Alabamians fell from 26% to 25.6% over the last 10 years, but in terms of raw number, actually increased by about 43,000 people. In terms of Alabamians identifying as Hispanic, that community increased from 3.9% of our population to 5.3%. And then most dramatically, Alabamians identifying as two or more races tripled from 1.5% to 5.1%. So when we think about the implications of that population growth in terms of equity, in terms of the identity of our state, we think it's really important to think about the struggle that Alabama has had historically since Reconstruction to embrace the idea that people living in this state who are not white men are fit to govern and have some sort of influence on the affairs of the state. Right now, we have, if we count up the offices, including our US senators, our US congresspeople, all of the executive committee members, such as the Commissioner of Agriculture, the Attorney General, if we add in the seats that make up the House of Representatives and the state Senate, that's about 212 different offices, also including the directorships and commissioner positions that the governor appoints. That's about 212 seats. 80% of those positions are held by white Alabamians, overwhelmingly white men. And I just mentioned that our population is 36% people of color. So what's on the line in terms of redistricting? When we think about the people we're electing and the people who reflect our interests, are we electing people who are sensitive to that contrast in terms of lives in our state and who's representing our state in leadership positions? Are we electing people who are concerned about our ability to continue to grow, who are concerned about our ability to reflect the best things of this state? And districting and fair districts impact who we're able to choose to represent us. Here right now, if we're thinking about quality of life and offering a community that incentivizes people to move to this state or remain here if they were born here, we have to be concerned that right now it's easier for us to walk into our communities, into many of the trade shows and buy an automatic rifle or an extended clip with armor-piercing ammunition. It's easier to buy things like that than it is to obtain a COVID-19 test, to find mental health care, to obtain employment that pays a living wage, to find public transportation wherever we live in the state. And our elected officials and the institutions that they lead play an important role in shaping that quality of life that we experience. So weighing in on districting is critical for all of our community members. We're at Alabama Forward and our coalition that's represented here today. We're working across traditional lines of difference within our advocate community to encourage our neighbors to get involved in creating fair districts that can be responsive to our community needs. And today I'm proud to be here with my colleagues who reflect the beauty of our state and the beauty of the collaboration taking place on the ground here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Milligan. One quick question. To what extent do you attribute the disparities in health access to the high infection rates in Alabama now due to COVID?
I think, Sandy, that's a great question. There's an important thing to think about when we consider the access that people have to healthcare providers. You know, in several of our counties over the last 5 years, for example, the public health infrastructure was defunded. And so when we think about the sort of misinformation that became characteristic and associated with COVID-19 over the last year and a half, in order to push back against that misinformation, people would need to have access to health providers and people that understand how vaccinations work, who they also trust. They would need to have a pre-existing relationship with those folks. And when we don't have that infrastructure, it's easy for misinformation to fill in those gaps. And that's something that unfortunately we're very concerned at is continuing to take place in our state. And I'd also like to add that, one thing to be very concerned about, though, is that while we don't have an infrastructure that allows people to get preventative care, that Medicaid would help, fill in that gap, or a public health infrastructure, we do have this hospital system where folks can show up once they're sick. And one thing we've heard from our conversations with medical personnel is this deep frustration many of them are feeling with, why do you trust us when you're sick? If we're the same people who have been asking you to become vaccinated and to do social distancing and things of that nature before you're sick, but you don't trust us, why is it that at the moment of becoming sick, you're coming to us to help aid in your healing? And that sort of gap in trust and in information can only be filled by year-round access to medical care, which is something that our state has not embraced. But hopefully with fairer districts, that and other policies would be a possibility here.
Sandy, you're muted.
Thank you. We have a number of questions in the chat box, but I'm going to move to our second speaker, and after our third speaker, come back to more questions. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Rodrisha Russa. She is Executive Director of the Ordinary People Society, TOPS, and part of the Alabama Election Protection Network. Ms. Russa, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. And I thank you, Evan, for bringing us on in. And I just want to introduce myself. First of all, my name is Rodrisha Russa. I am the Executive Director of the Ordinary People Society, formerly known as TOPS. I have been advocating for those living in marginalized and underserved communities since the age of 17. And so my organizing work goes really deep into not only just the African American community, but also in the Latino and Asian community as well. I transferred into Alabama. I relocated into Alabama back in 2006 from New York City. And when I came down to Alabama, I quickly realized all the disparities that was happening here in the state of Alabama. And that's where I found the organization, which is TOPS, the Ordinary People Society. TOPS has been in existence since 2001. We are the longest criminal justice reform and voting rights organization throughout the United States. And it was formed by Pastor Kenneth Glasgow, serving a 14 years incarcerated sentence, focused on criminal justice reform in the South. We have been advocating on all levels and advocating for families who are suffering from mass incarceration, homelessness, and also hunger. In 2017, we won the lawsuit against the state of Alabama for the moral turpitude, making sure that each eligible voter inside of jails and prisons have access to the ballot. And so since then, we have formed that lawsuit, and we began to develop different infrastructures within our communities to develop our advocates and our leaders to fight for the rights of those that are formerly and currently incarcerated. In 2019, we launched the Alabama Election Protection Network, which is a network of 3 different organizations: Hometown Action, Hometown Organizing Project, Black Women's Roundtable, and also the Ordinary People Society. And that was established to provide election protection for voters within the community. And so as we grew that infrastructure of that network, we began to talk about this powerful word, which is redistricting. It is a word that has been not so familiar within, especially the Black community. And so our focus was to educate, to provide public education to those that had no recollection or any history of redistricting. And so what we've been able to do with this network, also in partnership with Alabama Forward, is to be able to travel throughout the state of Alabama and provide our local communities with access to information regarding redistricting. Like Evan said, he touched on something really important, and that was the fact that we have to teach the Alabamians who are citizens the importance of redistricting, because it affects your quality of life at every single level. When we look at those that are formerly incarcerated, when they come out, most of them don't have access to housing. They don't have access to employment. A lot of them remain homeless or go back to a life of addiction. And so we have to make sure that they understand that redistricting impacts your growth and your quality of life. But what I wanted to share, because I know that we don't have much time on this forum, is that the issues of gerrymandering around the prisons. We've been advocating along with SCSJ.
Rodrigo, could you speak a little more slowly for our interpreters?
I'm so sorry. We have been working with SCSJ and different organizations around prison gerrymandering. And one thing that we teach on is that those that are inside are being counted as being housed in the general population within their prisons. Alabama has systemically placed prisons in more rural white areas so that the count, the population count is part of the census data. But what we have done in our advocacy of going in these prisons and jails is that ensure that all the inmates, which are people, are actually voting from where their home address is. And that decreases the population count within the census data, because it is unfair for those to be serving their time within jails and prisons and being counted as if they live there and they're actually housed in their hometowns in their own city. And so this is why this is important. But I want to pretty much close out by saying that we're continuing to bring public education. We have launched a campaign which is called Our Districts Are Alabama. You guys can go to our website and view it at our website, Our Districts Are Alabama, to bring awareness to the redistricting and also the reapportionment committees that are coming up. And we have been developing leaders. You'll hear from Felicia Scalzetti, which is one of our fellows, to actually draw and present maps. And so that's where we are right now. And we are going to continue to build advocacy across the state of Alabama to ensure that there's fair representation within all of our communities.
I have 2 quick questions. First, from our chat box, could you explain, you did win a lawsuit that actually allowed people in prison to have voting rights? Is that correct?
Yes, Pastor Glasgow challenged the state of Alabama, won a lawsuit in 2017, which is Glasgow versus Allen, to allow those that have certain felony convictions not involving a moral turpitude to be able to vote while they are actually incarcerated.
And you're really explaining that they should be counted in terms of the counties they live in rather than the counties where they are incarcerated. Is that correct? Okay, wonderful. I have a question from Vanessa Vargas that I would like you to ask, Vanessa, from Latino News, excuse me. Vanessa,
Hey.
hi. Great to
Hi,
see you.
Sandy. Great to see you too. Well, my question actually was for Evan. Is
That's
that
fine.
still okay?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Hey, and thank you guys for the speakers today. Thank you for joining us today. I'm here with Vanessa with Latino News. Evan, my question is about gender representation in the legislature. How many of the 135 legislators in Alabama are women? And is there a way to highlight gender representation in redistricting hearings?
That's a great question. I believe that there are 17 women serving in the House of Representatives, and I believe it's 5 in the Senate. I need to double check that number. In terms of your point about redistricting, I think when we look at the population of the state is predominantly women. And so looking at the infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rate, access to reproductive health, and all of the things here that Alabama makes exceedingly difficult for women in terms of healthcare, and of course, representation in leadership positions in government, it doesn't reflect the reality of who's actually living in our communities, in many instances, leading our families, leading institutions, churches, cultural groups, certainly our advocate community. The organization I serve is membership based. Overwhelmingly, many of our member groups are led by women who work all day doing activist work or advocacy work, and then go home and are the matriarchs and pillars of many of their families, if not communities. And so, the point you're making, I could only agree with you and say that's certainly a disparity that we're trying to speak to in our work on the ground.
Thank you. You're both two great speakers to lead us off. I'm going to move to our third speaker, who is Felicia Scalzetti, a Crowd Fellow based in Birmingham, who covers the Wiregrass area for Alabama Election Protection Network. Felicia, that's a mouthful. You will, I'm sure, explain.
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you for having me again. So my name is Felicia. I'm a community organizer and activist in Birmingham, Alabama, and I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to become a Crowd Fellow. What that means is CROWD stands for Community Redistricting Organizations Working for Democracy. It's a program that was created by the Southern Coalition for Social Justice out of North Carolina. North Carolina has redistricted 11 times in the last 10 years. Typically, this is a process that takes place once every 10 years, and they went through it 11 times because their maps were thrown out for being unfair and biased because they were gerrymandered. As a result of these multiple redistricting events, SCSJ has had a lot of experience in organizing and communicating with the public about redistricting, educating on involvement and how you can see your community be better represented, see your fellow Alabamians in this case be better represented in our electoral system. They decided to take that knowledge and to bring it to Southern states and to fund multiple fellows in each state. I am one of 4 fellows in Alabama, and I cover Central Alabama as well as the Wiregrass region, which is the southeast portion of the state. I am hosted by Alabama Election Protection Network, and I work with Rodricia, who is amazing, I may add. We really appreciate the setup because what it lets us do is tap into the resources that SCSJ has developed over 10 years, but really bring a regional and local approach to what we're doing. We know Alabama best, we know our communities the best, and by working together in our communities, by taking this knowledge that we've gotten, we can then see what works for Alabama to get a more equitable and fair redistricting cycle, to get more equitable and fair maps, and ultimately to get more equitable and fair representation. That is what we want out of this process. AEPN's goals in terms of redistricting are to educate, connect, train, and engage as many Alabamians as possible. We want to facilitate local community mapping groups, especially those that represent communities of interest and groups of people that are typically not represented. We have multiple speakers on here today and multiple news advocates that we don't usually see represented in our state legislature or in our city council meetings, or I'm sorry, in our city council seats. And I'm very, very excited to be working with a diverse coalition of people so that we can see a representation that actually reflects the state as it is. We are going to do this through 3 methods. One is there are going to be public hearings held by the reapportionment committee starting next week. These hearings are held exclusively on weekdays and during working hours. This process is fundamentally inaccessible. It is difficult to find the information about when the hearings are, to know the existence of them, or what the relevance are to redistricting to begin with. And then to add the added restriction of being during working hours, it makes it very difficult for everyday working Alabamians to access this process and to have their voices heard. So we want to communicate to people that they are able to submit written testimony and that the hearings will also be simultaneously broadcast virtually, and that you will be able to raise your hand virtually and to give public testimony during those hearings. That's very important. These hearings will be held over 7 separate days over the first 2 weeks of September, starting September 1st and ending on September 16th. In recognition that these meetings are inherently designed to be inaccessible and to be low, attended, so that the legislature can say that nobody cared to show up, the Alabama Fellows have decided to put on our own series of town halls. So every day that there is a public hearing led by the reapportionment committee, the 4 fellows, including myself, will hold a public town hall on Zoom that night from 7 to 8 p.m. So we will have one on September 1st, September 2nd, so on and so forth. The third thing that we are doing is training people to give testimony. As I mentioned earlier, you can submit written testimony ahead of time, but you can also submit it when the hearings are ongoing. So we expect that people who may not have heard of the process before or be very new to redistricting will attend, have questions afterwards, and we can help them to submit testimony. We want to make sure that everyone's voices are heard and equitably represented.
Thank you, Felicia. I'm going to move us into a couple of questions. We have one from Jungwon Lee for Rodrisha Russell. Jungwon, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi, I'm John. I need. Okay, yes, my name is John Lee. I'm attorney in Atlanta, Georgia, and so I'm writing story for Korea Daily Alabama edition. So I have 2 questions. So the first one is, how are people incarcerated in state and federal prison represented in Alabama? They can't vote, but are they counted for the purpose of reappointment? And the second is the Korean and the Asian immigrant. The number of non-citizen immigrants, especially from South Korea or Germany, is dramatically increasing in Alabama because of the auto plant, Hyundai or Bench. So they are not citizens, but are they counted for the purpose of the reappointment or restriction? Thank you.
Thank you, Jungwon. I'm going to let Ms. Russo answer your first question and Felicia answer your second.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Jungwon. If I understood what you were saying, yes, here in Alabama, those that are formerly incarcerated can vote as long as they don't have a crime that's involving moral turpitude, which is a crime that is causing danger or harm to somebody else. So for those that may have like a possession or something that is like in control substance that didn't harm somebody versus somebody that convicted a crime to harm somebody in a violent way, may be excluded from the voting apparatus. I didn't really hear your question too much after that. If did I answer your question?
Yes.
I know you had two of them. Okay. Okay. I want.
Okay, yeah,
And the
okay, so,
sorry, I just
Okay.
because of time, Jungwon.
okay, yeah.
Could
no
you
problem.
ask your
Yeah.
second question in the chat box? But
Yes,
gonna
I will, yeah,
I'm going to ask Felicia
Thank
to address your
Yeah.
question about growing API and specifically Korean presence, whether they're counted for the purposes of reapportionment. I believe that was your question.
Thank you for your question, Jungwon. That is correct. They are counted. Everyone is counted in the census regardless of their citizenship. If you were physically in the state on April 1st of 2020, you should have been and were counted as part of the census. What that means is that those are the raw numbers that we use to draw these districts. So if you live in an area, for instance, around the Hyundai plant, that has a predominant, like a large number of AAPI people, but who are not citizens and thus do not, cannot engage electorally, this process still has a lot of relevance to them. Even though they cannot, even though they cannot vote, the money that is grant money and such that gets distributed based on the system is going to affect them directly.
Okay, great. We have time for one more question from Raymond Tyler. Raymond, can you ask your question?
Sure. Good afternoon. My question, I had two, but I'll ask one. My question is, how does attendance and testimony at these hearings, at this point, does it have any solid impact?
That's a great question. Evan, would you address that?
Well, what is the impact?
What is the impact exactly?
Sure. So there's first the strategic point of using these hearings as an opportunity for education in two ways, in terms of the community members and the neighbors we serve, making sure that they're as informed as possible about the types of the format and the types of discussion that takes place in the meetings. And you can only really have that experience and learn that if you participate in it. Then we also want the folks that sit on that committee to hear directly from the community members, to a degree that they haven't experienced before. So that's the first point. The second point is, let's say the committee already has in mind the maps that they want to vote in, and that's a done deal. And that whatever we say in those meetings ultimately is, in one ear and out the other. Well, what follows, especially in states like this, is you have folks, asserting legal claims and working with some of the great civil rights organizations around the country, or even here locally, to let people know it when they feel that their rights were infringed upon. And so if it comes to that, it's really important to be able to show that there was a period where neighbors were saying, here's a concern of ours, here are maps we've drawn that can show you how to avoid cutting our community in half, or drawing a district in a way that undermines the strength of our vote. And the more we can show that the committee members were made aware of that, I think the more you can later say that there was a deliberate decision not to take that information into account.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move to our next speaker, Valerie Adams. And please ask our reporters to hold your questions. I have some great questions, but we'll just intersperse them after each speaker. So Valerie Adams is co-founder and president of the Alabama Indigenous Coalition, and she will speak about Native American stake in the redistricting process. Ms. Adams, thank you.
Well, thank you so much to the organizers for inviting us to this event. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to voice our opinions on what's happening in Alabama. And I think that prior to anything, I'd like to go ahead and do the land acknowledgement, acknowledging that if we're here in Montgomery, that is the land of the Muskogee Creek. but also was the land of the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, who also resided here and were removed. Typically, when I have these conversations with people, we're having to do an overview on history. And that is why the Alabama Indigenous Coalition was made. We were pivotal in trying to change some legislation to changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day in Tuskegee, Alabama and Montgomery, Alabama. We additionally found in our work that there's a vast amount of people that just feel left out of conversations. And so we formed this group in order to bring more of that together. Alabama itself is the home of 9 tribes, 1 federally recognized, 8 state recognized tribes. And I think that at this point, when we talk about why are there no Native Americans here, a lot of people are not familiar with the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act removed over 50,000 Native Americans from the southeastern states. And that was under Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, continued for 30 years. And so at this particular point, Alabama's population is about, Native American population is about 7%. So when we're talking about what is the impact and why did it happen that way, we seem to go into these processes of educating people as we go, instead of the schools educating people about what happened here and where is the role of Native Americans in Alabama. I've been a resident of Alabama for about 20 years. I come from a little tiny town in South Dakota called Wambly, South Dakota, which is located on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And I think that my observation of Alabama is that it can do so much more in terms of how our institutions, the media, the government play a role in how we are represented. I was lucky to meet a couple of Native American women that ran for office last year and this year, and shocked to find out that maybe less than 3% of Native Americans have been actively in office here in Alabama, period. You know, and so that says a lot about what's missing in the state. Today, I know we're here and we're talking about redistricting, and I guess I wanted in my input, you know, the Alabama Indigenous Coalition does not do a lot of work in redistricting because it's so vast. The Native community is so vast across Alabama, except for maybe Porch Creek and some of the state recognized. But the rest of us that are here in Alabama from other tribes, we somehow we feel left out, and that the stories are told are not accurate. We have,
just because of time, I'm going to ask you one quick question.
Okay.
Which when we talked earlier, you made such a powerful point. If you were more engaged, if you were more represented, you said you would see the impact in the schools. Could you explain that? In terms of what children learn about Alabama and your own history?
I think that's a twofold question, because part of that is that Native Americans are considered sovereign nations. And so as sovereign nations, that's government to government relationships. A lot of why we have not actively participated in that political process has to do with part of that. Now, Alabama itself, with the removal, again, you're talking about 50,000 people removed. And I think that we are just learning that these processes affect us. And so we're seeing great strides with some of the Native American representation across the country. Great strides with Deb Haaland, who's the Secretary of Interior now. Recently, we've had a Native American nominated to head the national parks. And I think that when we're having these conversations, they're not easy to answer that way. And if there is the impact of representation in our schools, like we're fighting now, just to have them understand that, yes, Native Americans were here. That was not the intent of Native Americans to leave their home. You know, laws were put in place to make it so at all different levels. And so go forward to today. Kids are getting taught like Pano-Indigenous studies. And when I say it that way, it means that they're teaching it as if there's only one tribe, when actually there are over 1,000 different tribes across the United States. And what Alabama could do for itself is be more accurate, have relevancy, be accountable. And I think that that's the role that we play with the Alabama Indigenous Coalition, is trying to increase equity in our schools, in our institutions.
That's very eloquently stated. Thank you so much. And I'm going to move to our next speaker. Again, I'm holding some great questions, some of which are for all of our panelists, and a couple are just for individuals. But let's go now to Ana Espino, Executive Director of the Alabama Coalition for Immigrant Justice. Ms. Espino.
Hi, thank you. I'm the Executive Director for a grassroots-led organization, Grassroots Informed. And what I have to add on to this conversation is that what's at stake for Latinos in equitable representation, stories are the way to go. And I'll remind everybody that as the 2020 shutdowns due to COVID started happening, we were able to see magnified the breakdown in our infrastructure, the breakdown in access to resources and information. And as a lot of information was being shared with the community in general about COVID-19, prevention, social distancing, everything that you can think of back in early 2020, including access to testing, we found that the information was not available for non-English speakers. Specifically for our community leaders, we were seeing that these life-saving efforts were not being translated into Spanish. So because there's not equitable representation, or we're not thought of in the state when these things are planned, it took a coalition of about 10 organizations to come together and just prompt Governor Ivey to make these resources available in Spanish and other languages. Fortunately, that was a win. If you are in organizing work, that is a big win for us. It was not happening, and then we have now information in Spanish, and we were very grateful for our local Latino media to really pick up a lot of that slack. And there is always that fine line between actually passing policy or passing something to happen, but then implementation. And we really saw our community affected once vaccines were available for folks. So again, for vaccine access, it was a huge barrier. There were a lot of doubts about where people could get the vaccine, where people could be seen or treated in a language that they felt comfortable in. Again, I'm talking about Spanish. And with very, very little luck, the governor's office or the Department of Health does not require an Alabama issued ID for vaccine access. However, third-party suppliers, a lot of volunteers and churches were asking folks for an ID. And there's a lot of misinformation. A lot of community folk are under the impression that the vaccine is going to cost them something. And how that translates into a need for our community is that we don't have access to resources. We don't have bilingual personnel giving the vaccines. And as an organization that does leadership development, that does grassroots community work, we have pivoted, as most of us have, into something else. So now we are a bridge that's working with other organizations, with the Hispanic and Latino media and churches and stores, so that we can host our own bilingual vaccine access clinics.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Espino. I'm going to go to our last speaker so we can reserve the last 10 to 12 minutes for Q&A. But that was a wonderful storytelling. All of you are really helping us understand what is at stake for the diverse communities of Alabama. Our last speaker is Irene Jaeyoung Do, who is with Alabama Korea Education and Economic Partnership, known as AKEEP. Ms. Do.
Hello, this is Jaeyoung Irene Do, working in AKEEP, Alabama Korean Education and Economic Partnership. Our mission is to provide multilingual and multi-diverse education to our community. I am in charge of research and development in special education and language access. Today, I'm going to talk about a Korean community who I am working for and provide services to. However, our organization and my work is not directly for redistricting, but we are a more educational organization, but I wish sharing my experience with Korean community in Alabama could help our community have better voices. So in Alabama, there are many Korean population and it is growing constantly. It is hard to get the exact number of Korean population with many reasons, but we estimate there are around 18,000 to 20,000 Koreans only in Montgomery, Auburn, and Prattville area by 2016. So now as of 2021, I assume there are more Korean people in Alabama. So what makes Korean people come to Alabama then? A lot of Korean big companies such as Hyundai and Kia drove Korean people to Alabama. When Korean people come to Alabama, like they don't come by themselves. They usually bring their families with them, enrolling their kids in schools, joining churches, becoming active in the community member, as a community member. But however, Korean people are having difficulties living in American society with language and culture barriers. It is hard for them to get access to educational and social services. For example, parents with children with disabilities, they are required to attend to an individual education plan, which is IEP meeting, and communicate with teachers daily basis for their children. But Korean parents have language barriers to talk about their child with the teacher. And on top of that, they are new to town, so like their lack of information. Not only the educational part, but when we talk about the medical field, there are many emergencies that require fast communication. So a lot of Korean people are afraid of these health-related situations because of language and cultural barriers, especially in this pandemic. Korean people face more difficulties and fear in daily life. I visited Advanced Wound Care Hospital for Korean interpretation services a few months ago. A Korean lady got big injury on her face while she was working in assembly. She said when the ambulance came, she couldn't advocate herself well, and her intention to explain which hospital she wants to go makes them more confusing. So because of the language barriers, she couldn't go to the hospital that she wanted to go and couldn't get the proper care right away. Like this, Korean people suffer from language and cultural barriers. This difficulties suppress Korean people and prevent them from taking full advantages of what America offers. But getting access to social services and taking advantage of these resources as a community member is the right. According to the Title VI of Civil Rights Act, there's a law that regarding of race, color, national origin cannot be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits. Also, the Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974 requires states and school districts to provide English learner students with appropriate services to overcome language barriers.
Irene, I'm going to ask you to wrap up. So we have questions and I want to make sure we have time. Do you want to just say your concluding remark?
All right. So yeah, there's a rights by law, and I just wanted to briefly say that to overcome those barriers, we're providing language assess, Korean education, Challenge America, but still Korean community needs more support and voices for us to fully immerse in our society. Yeah, that's
well
it.
stated.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to go to our first question, which is for Valerie Adams from Oni Advincula. Oni, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Valerie, I was just wondering, with the influx of Asian immigrants, to Alabama, like Koreans, how about Native Americans? Why are they not staying in Alabama for work or for any other reasons? Or are there any reservations left in Alabama?
I was answering your other question in the chat as we were speaking. There are 39 Native nations that were moved to Oklahoma, including the ones that were here. Who is left here that is still on a reservation is the Porch Creek Band of Indians, and also I believe MOA considers their area a reservation as well. The other groups I think are more so scattered out throughout Alabama, and they're not necessarily considered reservations, but by any terms, reservation would be federally recognized.
Great, thank you. I have a question from John Zippert, who is asking this of all the panelists. So each of you, it's important to give your perspective. He is with the Greene County Democrat, and thank you, Mr. Zippert, for this excellent question. He asked me to read it. One critical issue on redistricting is whether community groups should push for 2 congressional seats that we could elect a Black or brown congressperson. This probably would involve risking the one sure district we have that is represented by Congresswoman Terry Sewell, who is Black. I'm interested to hear the panel's comments. I may start with Felicia on this because I know you live in that Terry Sewell's district. What is your perspective?
I think the framing of risking the seat is the wrong one. It's understandable one, but it's the wrong one. Terry Sewell's district is so overwhelmingly Democratic and so overwhelmingly Black that you could take a large number of people out, and she would still very safely win that seat. You could draw a second majority minority district and still have her easily 55 percent Black voting age population and 60% Dem. That area is incredibly Democratic. The issue becomes the majority of the area she represents geographically is the Black Belt, and we've seen a decrease in people living in the Black Belt. They've been moving out and into more urban areas, and so her district, as it stands right now, is actually does not have enough people in it to be a district going forward. We need to add more space, and what that will likely do is increase these disparities. Will become more Black and more Democratic, more Democrats packed into it, which takes away from other districts around it, so that we only have, I believe about 40% of Alabamians typically vote Democrat, and we have 1 congressional district out of 7 and 1 congressional district out of 7 that is represented by a Black woman. So that those proportions are off. If we ever hope to achieve any kind of equity, like, we need to have more districts, and I think it is absolutely doable without risking your seat. Yes.
Okay. Mr. Milligan or Ms. Russell or any of our other speakers, we can have time for one other person to share their perspective on this question. Ms. Espino, who would like to answer?
I'll just throw out, Mr. Zipper, thank you for your question. It's not totally clear that that district is safe, so to speak, now because of the way that it's drawn and the way that courts have shifted and the way that the Voting Rights Act has, you know, the enforceability of it has changed. It's not really clear what would happen if that district is, as it stands now, is challenged in court. So one thing that we're thinking a lot about is the way that having maps that reflect county boundaries and existing municipal boundaries can create a rationale for the structure of the map that hopefully could survive litigation. And we think, building on what Felicia was saying, we think it's possible to build maps that both pay respect to the people living in the Black Belt and work to protect their voting power, and also hopefully make another district that is more competitive than those that we have now.
Thank you. I have a question that's come in on my text for Ms. Espino from somebody who is on the call but not on the Zoom. And that is, the question is, to what extent is Alabama a home to people without legal documents? And to what extent has that affected your organizing work around redistricting?
So I think the answer to that is complicated. The reality is that many Latinos live in mixed status families. So it's very likely that it could be 50-50%. And how it affects our work, it affects because you have citizens who can vote and citizens and residents who don't vote. However, they can persuade community folk, friends, church leaders, so that they could vote in alignment with their values and their ideas. So in essence, as far as our organizing efforts, it really gives us an opportunity to duplicate and replicate very quickly our reach with community folk at large, other than Latino.
Great, thank you. And I have one question for Ms. Doe from the chat, which is the extent to which you feel Koreans living in Alabama are aware of the surge of anti-Asian hate, and whether this has become something of a galvanizing issue for them. I know your focus is on education and economic outreach, but your personal observation on that would be helpful to this reporter.
Yes, like I feel like people aware of it, not only aware of it, they have a fear that like going to the street and something could happen. So I think most of the Korean people have that fear and they're afraid of it.
Thank you. I'm going to ask each of our speakers for a 30-second soundbite. We're almost at the end of the hour, and this has been a wonderful, wonderful sharing of perspectives and realities on the ground around redistricting, for which we are very grateful. Our last question from our reporters: what would you most like to see our ethnic media colleagues report? What would help your work? What is a story you would like us to tell over and above the great story ideas that have come out of this meeting? And I'll start with Mr. Milligan.
Thank you. One story is there's a multicultural movement here in the state that is not even new. This is the newest, we're the newest people hoping to carry on the torch that people have passed on to us. Redistricting is one way we hope to show up. We hope to show up around voter registration, voter education, many other ways. So please partner with us, stay in touch with us. You know, there are a lot of stories here to tell, and this is just a slice of it.
And that is a multi-ethnic call to action by a multi-ethnic sector of media. Let me ask the same question to Rodrisha Russell. What would you most like to see a story in ethnic media?
What I would like to see in the in the media is that, you know, this is, once again, I said it before, this is our districts, this is our Alabama, and we are citizens. We understand the landscape of our communities, and I know that if that's put more out in the media, that we can really shape Alabama and change the apparatus in Alabama around redistricting and voting rights. It will move us and move the needle further than what we have ever been before. So that's what I would share.
Thank you. Felicia Scalzetti, what would you like to see in ethnic media reporters cover most?
You do not need to be an expert in mapping, redistricting, or anything to participate in this process, to meaningfully change and be involved in this process. We have all worked very hard to try to understand what is happening so that we can empower people to tell their own stories. What is happening in your communities is important. It's important for the future of the state. It's important for all of us, and it's important to build a better future for Alabama.
Thank you. Anna Espino, what would you like the ethnic media to cover most? A story.
I would like ethnic media to lift up the fact that redistricting affects all Alabama residents, regardless of status, whether or not they've been formally incarcerated, regardless of where they come from or who they are. It's an issue that affects everyone in the community, in the state. And so a call for a need to invest a holistic approach into having these conversations made available to everyone in our communities.
Great. Valerie Adams, what would you most like ethnic media? What is your call to action for us? Valerie? Okay, we are over the hour, so we may have lost Valerie. There were wonderful stories in all of your presentations, but we'll give the last word to Ms. Doe. What would you most like to see in ethnic media?
As education organization, I like to see about the in the educational or social services, there's like Korean people can access to the services that they need. And I think it will be wonderful to see that.
Okay, I am going to let all of us take a deep sigh and express our gratitude for a great group of speakers. We learned so much from you, and very grateful to Alabama Values, to Anisha Hardy. I will send follow-up fact sheet and story ideas that my colleague Anthony and I have put together and been texting each other throughout this wonderful hour. Thank you so much to all our speakers. Thank you to our reporters, and this conference is now closed.